Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Advancing Accessibility Tools and Tactics for Meeting the ADA Title II Guideline. I'm your host, Julia McElroy. Thank you for spending time with us today. The National Association of State Procurement Officials is a nonprofit association dedicated to advancing public procurement through leadership, excellence, and integrity. Here on the Research and Innovation team, we work to improve the profession by sharing expertise, fostering learning, and promoting innovative best practices in public procurement through webinars like these. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. All attendees are muted. You can enter comments and questions in the chat box. If you'd like to ask our presenters a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions will be addressed during the Q&A session. At the close of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief questionnaire. Today's presentation is good for 1 contact hour. To receive your certificate, simply complete the questionnaire following the presentation. Your feedback is valuable to us at NASPO, and we appreciate your responses. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. We're honored to have with us Rachel Doherty, Chief Procurement Officer, and Jay Wyant, Chief Information Accessibility Officer, both from the great state of Minnesota. NASPO is excited to have Rachel and Jay with us today. Rachel, please take it away.
Good afternoon. My name's Rachel Doherty, as Julia said. The title on the slide is wrong. Anyways, I've served in this role for about a year. And prior to that, I was Enterprise Contracts Counsel and worked in professional technical contracting. I'm going to hand it over to Jay and let Jay introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Somehow the keyboard didn't work like it was supposed to. I'm Jay Wyant. I'm the Chief Information Accessibility Officer for the state of Minnesota. I've been in that role since 2012 when they created it, following the law that was created in 2009 for data accessibility. Thank you. So, Rachel, I can do this if you like. So please select a statement that's true for you. We have a quick poll. Please put in the chat whatever your answer is. So either you've never heard about digital accessibility, or you've heard of it but don't know much about it, or you dip your toe into the topic, or you've actually read some of the required success criteria. Wow, so I'm so impressed how everybody's participating. Love it. The people are actually typing and stuff. You got a wide range. It's about everything.
Well, the good news is I think there's probably something for everyone in this presentation. So regardless of where you're at on digital accessibility.
And I'm so glad that you're all here. So again, this is Jay speaking. Let's talk for a few minutes about why we do this. So Rachel will go first, and then we'll follow up later. So Rachel, you're on.
So as I mentioned, previous to this role, I was Enterprise Contracts Counsel, and we started on a journey with Jay's team on how to better integrate accessibility into our procurement processes. And I have to admit, it was a bit of a frustrating process. And as many of you know in the room as procurement people, there's a lot of things that we're trying to work into our solicitations, environmental, social considerations that we're all evaluating as part of our solicitations. And anyways, one of the things that really helped me kind of turn the corner and see this differently was taking Jay Wyant's training. And maybe it's not exactly Jay's training, but he promotes it, and it's on the state of Minnesota's IT accessibility website. And just learning some simple principles in how to make things accessible. And there's these you can download the PDFs right on the website of Microsoft digital accessibility quick cards. And I learned how easy it was to incorporate accessibility into just everyday practices. But one of the things that really got me was once we moved to the digital environment in 2020, where all of our documents went from paper to kind of living in DocuSign, that made an immense difference to people, specifically like people who are blind, and being able to have a screen reader read the entire document. Before, it would be a scan. Maybe you put it through the PDF OCR function, but oftentimes it wasn't. And so we've been living in this digital environment that really improved things. And the, state services for the blind was particularly like happy about this. And someone took a contract, removed it from the digital environment, printed it, scanned it, and then put it back in DocuSign. And it left the document unreadable to a vendor that was blind, and the contract had to be read out loud. And I thought about like experience, and I was kind of mad because that document is really important in that vendor operating their business, and that contract is a tool, and we took away that vendor's ability to use it as a tool because of the removal from the digital environment. And I just thought that like I don't want things like this to happen again. And what do we do to make sure that things are accessible and available to all? And once you get used to digital accessibility, you realize that it's better design, it's more user-friendly design, period. And all of us can benefit from the features that you build into accessible design. And we have our contract releases at the Office of State Procurement. They describe how to use our contracts, and I picked those contract releases as something that was in desperate need of a refresh. And part of the reason I picked it is they're not user friendly. And that also means they're not accessible in a lot of instances. And one of my colleagues was shocked that I picked them because he's like, this is my area. Like, why are you so worried about my area? He was just kind of shocked that I expressed the concern. But the reason I did was because I realized that these documents are unusable for so many people and there's a better way. So we're here to talk about that better way. I'm going to hand it over to Jay. Jay, you're on mute. So you need to start over.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. So I have here a picture of a pickle jar. So we're here to talk about what is a disability. And so if you can imagine a pickle jar and you're trying to open it and you do everything you can, you bang it upside down on the table, you put it under hot water, you use a rubber gasket, you do everything you can to open it, and you can't open it. So then the question becomes, is it you? Are you just simply not strong enough? Your hands are not thick enough, or something about you that cannot open that jar? Or is it the jar? And that's a metaphor that I like to use to describe the difference between what we call the medical model of a disability and the social model of a disability. So if you look at me, for example, I had bilateral cochlear implants. I was born deaf, and I grew up with hearing aids with very, very little sound coming from the hearing aids. I got these implants at an adult, in my late 40s, and the sound was amazing. I am able to hear far more, far better, and understand speech far better than I ever could before. I heard birds for the first time, and that's when I learned they do not shut up. Still, they don't make me hearing. I am still deaf. I still have an accent. I still need to see people's faces when they are speaking to understand what they are saying. I take them off. I hear nothing. So the medical model, the idea of putting a prosthetic on your body or your brain or whatever, or taking drugs, medication, those kind of things, they can, to some extent, help mitigate or minimize disability, but they rarely fix a disability. The social model, the World Health Organization describes a disability as a mismatch between the individual and the environment. So if you think about changing the way the environment operates to minimize, maybe reduce the disability, or eliminate the disability, that's a social model. And a quick example of that is my house in Minneapolis. It's built in 1903, which means there are steps to get into the house. and there's no bathroom on the first floor. So my mother-in-law cannot visit us because she has really bad knees, can't go up and down the stairs to go to the bathroom, had a difficult time getting to the house. Other people with mobility disability will also have difficulty in my home. So that's the social model. Instead of building a house or an environment or a web application or a document that works without requiring a person to go through all steps like having someone read the document to them. So you don't put the disability on the person. Think about how the environment can exacerbate or cause issues for people with disabilities as well as possibly for others. So then we talk about that's a disability. What about digital accessibility? What is it? It is actually definable, measurable, and touchable. It's not something you have to guess about. In the question, the quick poll, we mentioned the WCAG guidelines, that's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We'll talk more about that. Those are actually very specific, and they apply to all digital content, whether it's a website, a web application, a document, mobile devices, mobile app, anything. And all those four principles, the four principles of the WCAG guidelines called POUR, perceivable, audible, understandable, and robust. Think about those terms for a moment. Perceivable does not mean that there's no one particular way you might perceive an application. So let's say a person looking at a digital document, they might perceive it by visually reading the document, or they perceive it by having an application like a screen reader read the document to them. Or perhaps they use reflectable braille reader and they are feeling the document, feeling the content of the information. So to perceive, to be accessible means it must be available to all modes of operation, not just one or two. Same thing with operable. I might operate only with a keyboard, or I might operate only with a mouse, or I might operate with a combination, or I might use a chip-up device. Again, the application must be open to operate in all those modalities. Understandable. It's not in plain language is part of it, but also in how it's organized on the screen. It's clearly laid out in a very effective way where you know where you need to go, or it's a mismatch, or it's an overlapping. So also understandable has to do with design, layout, content, information, and the presentation of that information. Robust essentially means it doesn't break when the assistive technology is applied. In other words, if I have a software like a screen reader or a Zoom magnifier or Drag Dimensionally Speaking, some other assistive technology, and I'm using that, the application should function. It should not go and break, which sometimes it has done in the past where it's not accessible. So digital accessibility is a very well-defined, meaningful construct of guidelines and rules. And if you follow those, you can then make things accessible. I have here a screenshot of the Web Content Accessibility Guideline quick reference page. You can see on the left the listing of all of the elements of the WCAG, and on the right are a screenshot of a close-up of it. You can see everything broken down into categories. So perceivable, number one, that's the principle, okay? Then we have the guideline 1.1, test alternative. Then we have the test criteria with 3 digits, 1.1.1, non-test content. So the test criteria are the elements of WCAG that people designing, creating, planning, building, and testing for accessibility. That's what they use. And there's a whole bunch of them all laid out. So the basis of digital accessibility, we have the physical and the digital component. You may understand about the American Disabilities Act. The ADA will be 36 years old in July. It's been around for a while. And people are familiar with that in terms of what we call the built environment. So the width of the doorway, the height of the handrail, the thickness of the handrail, the slope of a visor. Okay? So that's pretty well established. They're very specific about how to make buildings in the built environment accessible for people with physical needs. When the war started moving to the digital environment, the U.S. Department of Justice applied principles of accessibility, like WCAG 2.0, to define accessibility, but it was never written down. It was all case law, was all agreement between attorneys. So for over 30 years, actually since 1997 through 2003 was the beginning of it, they said, yeah, we need to apply the principles of the ADA to the digital environment. But it's all based on case law. There was nothing actually written down. They did generally reference WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 1.0 previously. So we have all that things here, all text and images, captions and transcripts, color contrast, and so forth. So that's where we got so far the concept of digital accessibility applied to the ADA. So what are the elements of digital accessibility? So generally 4 or 5 different groups. We got cognitive disability, like comprehension, dyslexia, short-term memory, and so forth. We have motor elements. You have difficulty moving your mouth, so you only use the keyboard because you have tremors, or you have physical elements, muscular dystrophy, and so forth. Or you have hearing disabilities like me. I'm deaf, so I'm unable to hear, and I need to read the text, or I need the interpreter. Or I have an auditory processing disorder. You can hear, but your brain doesn't interpret the same way as others do. Standard vision. You are blind. Very few people are completely blind. Many have very limited vision, ocular vision, or low vision. And we have an experience lab on our website where you can look at how those things can impact people. So again, Rachel, do I hand it off to you? Let me know when I have to hand it off to you. I tend to forget. So the ADA requires a local government has to provide individuals with disability with effective communication. So that's been the term that justified applying it to digital environment was effective communication. Okay. And then the cities and counties and all have to follow that. So we've had quite a few lawsuits, for example, against counties for the last 25 years, because they've been pretty exposed to this need to be accessible. So besides people with disabilities, can you think of any other reasons why we should support accessibility? Keep in mind a few things that Rachel said earlier. And I've got here a picture of a big combine more into a wheat field. Maybe that gives you some idea about other good reasons to think about accessibility. Feel free to put in the chat if you like. Let me give you an example. You've all probably are aware of broadband issues. You've probably been involved in your state in terms of procuring broadband contracts. So you can imagine people in rural areas not having high bandwidth. Well, looking at my phone, for example, I do not download pictures by default on my phone. So I can get a picture, but I can't see what it is because it just shows the picture icon. If I use alternative text, or the people created the image, use alternative text, that text can show up saying what the picture is, and I don't need to see the picture. Or I can determine whether I want to download that picture. So alternative text is a good way to expand as people are talking about the audience to other people or other tools. And again, another element is digital literacy. So quite a few people in the rural areas as well as in urban areas are older and less literate. Digital accessibility, as Rachel said, also helps you create better, easier to use, more effective communication modalities. So it really helps people with low digital literacy, Julia said. So you think about a larger audience with more wider range of needs that are correlated to people with disabilities. So whose job is it? I'm Chief Information Accessibility Officer. I work in the IT department for the state of Minnesota. Does that mean it's an IT issue? No. Everybody that sees Rachel does not work in IT. She has to be aware that not only is she making the documents accessible, but all the contracts, all the RFP, all the information has to be there. That in terms of solicitation, has to define and explain in those documents our expectations for accessibility, which means the requirements that people in the business side are thinking about their application have to go forward. So people who create documents, buy content, buy applications, plan for things, install them, all have to think about accessibility, or it will not work if you cannot retrofit it at the end. So what does it look like? When we talk about accessibility, what do we mean by this? I talked a little bit about web content accessibility guidelines or WCAG 2.1. But what does that mean? So let's take a look. The basic guidelines for all content, whether it's a document or a mobile app or web page. In all those environments, you have to have structure. So for example, when you create a document and you want to have a heading, a top level heading, you don't just make it bold, line font, beautiful color. You actually use a style, heading level 1, that append the code to that text to say, this is the level 1 heading. Same thing, next level heading, like an outline format, level 2, you append the code to that, and you don't have to think about the code. Microsoft Word, for example, just use the style heading 1, heading 2, and that puts the code in it, and that code passes through from the document to the PDF or the web page. Then properties is another example. You see, I have a little image of a web page with a tab on the top. So if you have, like me, multiple browser windows open in your browser, each tab on that should have a unique name corresponding to that particular page. If you're on a website and they have the same name regardless of what page you are on, that's not helpful, because then how do people know, looking at a tab, which page am I looking at? That's the property, that's the title of the document. Navigation. If you're like me, you remember the bad old days of the 80s and 90s with the first developing websites, and every page was different because it was cool. So it's hard to understand what to do and how to behave. Now, people are creating web pages, for the most part, that are consistent and behave as expected. And the layout changes, it's because the type of content, type of information has changed, and the layout corresponds to that type of information. Again, images and non-text elements. We talked about alternative text. So someone who is blind or has low vision or is otherwise using the machine to understand what's on the content. If I have your alternative text describe the image there that's appropriate, then they understand what that is without having to look at the image. Color contrast. People with low vision, people with vision, other kind of vision issues like color blindness, they need to be able to have enough contrast between the text and the background, or between the joining color, and the very specific rules about how you can measure that. And free tools that allow you to do that. Meaningful link. You probably all seen those enormous SharePoint links, 5, 6, 8 lines long with all kinds of gobbledygook. Doesn't tell you anything about what that means is. Instead, if you have the content, actual content on the page, whether it's a document or website, saying the name of where you're going, and that is the link. That's a meaningful link. One of my favorite keyboard shortcuts is Control-K. Select your content, select Control-K, you put the URL in there, and you're good to go. Forms are a whole other ball of wax. A lot of stuff you have to do to think about forms to make them meaningfully accessible. So I'm not going to talk about that today. So now let's turn it over to Rachel, and she'll talk about it from her perspective as a CPO.
Thank you, Jay. One of the comments I want to go back to is when we were talking about like how accessibility, like what are the benefits of accessibility and issues, and one of them was like elderly people not having smartphones. And just to expand on that a bit, it seems there's a lot of assumptions when you listen to people talk, whether they're decision makers who are the ones deciding who gets to use certain government services and programs, or just the general population. Like, well, why wouldn't they be able to apply for that service? It should be easy. And the truth of the matter is, it's not always easy. It's not easy necessarily for people who are elderly. It's not easy for people who lack digital literacy in general. And it's not easy for many people who have disabilities, because the things that we buy and that we create at the government level are not always accessible. And accessibility has the benefit of making things more usable for all. So Jay, you can advance next slide. So we have Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it requires state and local government to make their websites, mobile apps, and other content accessible. So it's a technical standard as compliance with WCAG 2.1, level A and AA. All digital content, course materials, third-party applications, and documents must be accessible. So if it's educational content that you're offering, maybe whether it's internally as an agency or externally outwards, they have to be accessible. Third-party content that public entities use to deliver services. We are rolling out a new system in the state of Minnesota, which is very important in the state of Minnesota, but our electronic licensing system for things like fishing licenses. We have 10,000 lakes. We do a lot of fishing here. And anyways, that now it has created this new system where people can access a fishing license from their smartphone. But we want that to be accessible. And even though it's created by a third party vendor, it still has to be accessible. There are limited exceptions that require documentation. So there was a deadline that passed April 24th, 2026, that was changed to April 26, 2027 for public entities with a population of 50,000 or more. And then as of April 26, 2028 for the public entities with less than 50,000. So that deadline was extended, but whatever, if you were on the path to building more accessibility into your procurement and to maybe remediating things around your own offices, don't stop. Keep on going. Keep on, plugging through at the pace that you are, or maybe, you might need to pick it up a little. Who knows? But also, if you haven't started, you have a year. So you have a whole year to start changing practices, and we're going to go through some of those things that you can do within your office. All right, next slide, Jay. So now I mentioned, as I talked about earlier, that this did not always feel like a natural partnership to me. Um, but digital accessibility and procurement have to go hand in hand. It is no longer some niche compliance issue that just kind of there's an office in the state's IT agency that cares about this. It goes like beyond that. People are looking for digital accessibility, and especially as people are trying to access more services that our government offers that are now, in many cases, almost exclusively offered in a digital environment. It is now a core business requirement. And procurement is the gateway. We are the people where things filter through in order to get purchased. So it's digital tools, services, and platforms that employees and citizens rely upon. We have to integrate accessibility into our sourcing, or your entire organization inherits risk. And there are ways, and we're going to talk about how we use these tools like wisely to make sure that we get digital accessibility with the vendors that we select and the services that we provide. Next slide. So what's at stake? That inherited risk. So inaccessible vendor solutions can trigger ADA. Title II is still coming. And there is like case law where even though maybe Title II isn't active right now, the deadline is a year out, you still could get in legal trouble. The operational friction. Employees with disabilities face daily barriers in the tools purchased, leading to lost productivity and higher support demand. And, so this is our internal employees, but it's also external as well when, somebody tries to buy a fishing license on that application and it doesn't work. And then they're calling the Department of Natural Resources and they're trying to figure out how they can buy a fishing license. It's a public trust issue. Procurement decisions directly shape the accessibility of customer and team member digital experiences. So if you spend, 2-3 years procuring maybe some new something related to Medicaid, like a big, huge, expensive thing that absolutely needs to work because people need to access services. And that thing goes live and it goes live, and a whole bunch of people who likely maybe need Medicaid cannot use it because it's not accessible. You have a big problem on your hand. You have a whole lot of people that are going to ask like, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me this was important? So we have to make it important from the starts of our processes. It's a cost containment tool. Retrofitting accessibility post-purchase is very expensive. It is much, much cheaper to do it from the outset and to make sure that we are buying things that are accessible and working with vendors that know how to build digital accessibility into the things that they are selling us. Next slide. So the business case, and we're going to talk about some tools that help us, that really help with these things like quality assurance. Accessibility correlates strongly with usability and product maturity. So things that are accessible are generally more usable. They are more friendly documents to interact with. And I don't know about, it's like when I'm trying to read an article on a newspaper, and especially if I've maybe paid for my subscription, I get really angry when a pop-up comes up and I can't get that pop-up to go away. Those are things that like that's not very digital accessibility friendly, and doesn't create for a good user experience. Vendors with established accessibility practices, they have stronger security, documentation, and governance processes. They are generally more mature organizations that are overall likely to just give you a better product. Uh, Accessible tools support a wider range of employee needs, enabling higher engagement and retention. I've given a couple different versions of this presentation. I'm also an attorney, and I've given it to other attorneys as well from the employment law perspective. And one of the things, there's a video that we share where giving somebody like an iPad that has transcription capabilities really can meet somebody's needs in a really like easy, user-friendly way. That's how a lot of accessibility tools are. Another comment I noticed about like what are other reasons to support accessibility? One is expanding your audience. They expand the market and reduce barriers to adoption. You can still get a good old-fashioned, our fishing licenses come on stickers. You can still get a fishing license like that, but why would we limit a whole, sector of the population from having the easy, accessible version on your smartphone? So that's a way to kind of expand your market. And when we think about companies, like I've noticed that when I want to read an article on the New York Times, like sometimes I also want to clean out my cupboards while I'm doing that. And I can actually play the article. They'll read it out loud. That's an accessibility feature. And that's something that benefits everybody. And I don't know, maybe it's slightly more likely that I retain my New York Times subscription because I can use it more. I can use it while I clean my cupboards, or I can use it while I'm relaxing at the end of the day reading an article. So that's, and it reduces barriers overall to adoption of our services. And often, maybe there is a paper pathway at the government to get the application in. But overall, I think the digital environment makes our jobs easier too. So supporting that and making sure the things we buy support digital accessibility matter. So what should procurement require? It should be treated like any other vendor requirement, and it should be integrated into solicitations, contract terms, and then into vendor due diligence during the contract. So the key vendor outputs that we're looking for is where current and accurate VPATs. So that's a voluntary product accessibility. I know maybe Jay, you could put that in the chat. I don't always remember my acronyms. Roadmaps for remediation. So if you have a vendor that's coming on to fix the thing that you maybe can't afford to totally replace, but you're going to have them remediate it, you want to give them a roadmap with like markers. Accessibility testing and third-party audits. Like this is really, really important. And this is something that we've done a much better job at the state of Minnesota, in my opinion, at integrating uh, testing into into the contract. So there are, key points, key milestones where we're engaging in accessibility testing. We have vendors that we've selected for their accessibility testing capabilities. Because, if you get 75% of the way done and you are not testing for accessibility and you find out it's mostly accessible, you're going backwards and you have to remediate as part of the contract. It's also, you want to have a clear product owner for accessibility issues. And this matters because if you just kind of go and chat with Joe developer and you start talking about accessibility, he goes, okay, we'll do that. If Joe developer doesn't have an understanding of accessibility, you don't really necessarily know whether he is going to appropriately communicate with the people that know how to build in that accessibility so it actually happens. So you want kind of a one-stop shop within the vendor to talk to about accessibility issues. Next slide. So procurement can be a driver of vendor behavior. So we have an opportunity here to shift the market, making accessibility evaluation a weighted factor in vendor selection. Preferring vendors who demonstrate that maturity, tracking accessibility as a contract requirement, and then publicly communicating organizational requirements so vendors plan proactively. So when we say that we're buying things that are digitally accessible, the government is a massive market. That is why some of these companies have entire divisions dedicated to selling to the government. So when we demand that vendors adopt digital accessibility practices, policies, procedures, and that they sell us products that are digitally accessible, then those products become more available to the market as a whole, and we improve the environment for everyone. Next slide. So what can you do? I'm going to talk about the tools and how we build this into procurement, and the things that really matter for the different kinds of purchases that we make. So it's really important that you start with what you are buying and how does accessibility apply to it. So if you're buying software, and that can be, custom, commercial off the shelf, or software as a solution. It can be website development, or it might be digital documents. And I will say, the document, that's been an area for a while that for a long time was overlooked. And we didn't necessarily have a clear requirement in our contracts that digital documents were accessible as well. And I had a agency that they asked about accessibility in the beginning of the process, knowing that they would have to post these documents online. And it was an agency that I would say had a bit more of a vested interest in this product being accessible because of the audience who would be consuming it. And they didn't check throughout the product, throughout the development, and the PDF was inaccessible. And it was 1,000 pages. And it's you really do have to start at the beginning, and it makes a huge difference. And to remediate that would be so expensive. So the digital document, you can't overlook that. And how are you communicating about accessibility needs in your procurement documents? First, it's the belt, which is a solicitation, and then your suspenders, which is the contract. So we're going to check from the outset to see if they are capable. And then we're going to check along the way to make sure that they are actually being capable. And we do that by building testing into our process, whether it is software, or whether it's digital documents, or whether it is a website. And then you also want to involve and engage accessibility experts. I found some digital accessibility experts across our enterprise that help me, people that are other than Jay. And that's really important because there are different perspectives, and there's things that you can miss that would really be beneficial for a particular group of people. So I think, less is more. And in general, having some, accessibility experts, or at least people who know enough to be dangerous within your procurement office also really matters, because you start to kind of be able to hear yeah, they don't really get it, or they do. So that matters too. And also, when you have champions of accessibility in your office, they are way more likely to make sure that it matters in the solicitation. So what are you doing along the way? That matters too. And that's the checks along the way, and that we're not just kind of letting a vendor and kind of crossing our fingers and hoping for the best. So we're going to go over our tools. So if you need new software, you're going to use that voluntary product accessibility template, the VPAT. And it's a document filled out by the vendor that explains how their software, hardware, or electronic content conforms to accessibility standards. So, so it's a very technical document that they fill out, and it's kind of an explanation of how it works and how they've integrated accessibility into it. So what if you have an end product that is a custom creation of the contractor? So you want to ask for what we call policy-driven adoption for accessibility. You might remember a couple slides ago when I talked about the maturity of an organization, and how that a more mature organizations often are very good at accessibility, but the PDAA helps us evaluate that. It allows us to look at the vendor as an organization to measure their internal support for accessibility. So if a company is very good about having their own internal policies about accessibility and creation of accessible things, they are way more likely to produce something for you that is accessible. You want to put the contractor on notice about accessibility requirements. Then you want to do, like, those are the terms and conditions. And there are specific provisions that put vendors on notice that accessibility requirements will apply to the final deliverable. And just a word of caution, when Jay said in the very beginning of the presentation, whose responsibility is this? Is this the IT shop's responsibility? Is it procurement office's responsibility? The things that we're buying now, almost everything has a digital component to it. So I would just encourage you to have terms and conditions related to accessibility in all of your contract documents. Don't just limit it to IT. I've just found IT sneaking its way into all kinds of different things that we're buying. And I'm sure you guys have as well. And then accessibility testing is a tool that you use when you want to make sure that whether the contract is building accessibility into the end product. And it's a process of evaluating a digital product, and there's different ways of doing it. It can be manual, automated, or there can be testing like specific technology. And that's why sometimes I go to a specific person that I know in state services for the blind who tests with a screen reader. So that's sometimes a place where I'll go. I will say, I have people come to me when I tell them their documents aren't accessible, and they tell me, well, I ran it through Microsoft accessibility checker. And that is, it's a great tool. It can be really helpful. I actually really like integrating it when I'm like working on PowerPoints, and just having that running as I'm working on it. But it's not perfect. It doesn't do very well at, like, one of the things that we're doing in our contract documents is we put directions in red because we really, really, really want people to take the instructional text out of the document, and they're way more likely to take it out if it's red. But a screen reader is not going to pick up on that red text. So we also put brackets around the text and indicate with the direction that instructions are indicated by red bracketed text. Microsoft Word won't pick up on that. So it's not perfect. It's a tool in the toolbox, but a limited one. But accessibility testing generally goes like far beyond that, if you really want to make sure your product is accessible. So custom software, how do you ensure the people building it understand and are capable? So the VPAT for that completed product or project, and then a narrative on their accessibility capabilities. You want to ask for that PDAA, and then you can also test their previous project. So, they might give you, if you're doing something custom, it's brand new. So you're asking from their VPAT for something that is already completed, and they're showing you with that VPAT that they have an understanding of accessibility and built it into the thing that they did before. And they're also telling you about their accessibility capabilities. That PDAA, which really helps us evaluate the contractor on their own internal capabilities and how they've integrated it into their organization. And then demonstration and the testing of that previous project. So you're gonna, they might have written you the VPAT, but you're gonna go see for yourself whether that is accessible. So software as a service. commercial off the shelf. You should be able to request a VPAT. And if you plan on customizing that software, you should also request that policy-driven accessibility tool. So you can look at how they've integrated accessibility practices into their own organization. Website, that PDAA is going to be good, and then a demonstration testing of their previous development, and the same with like digital documents. You want to see that they have an understanding of accessibility and that they're building it into their own organizations. And I also just want to emphasize to you to build accessibility principles into your own organizations. In our office, every single team member that touches digital documents or templates is required to take the accessibility training that Jay has on their office's website. And I want to make sure that people touching the documents preserve its accessibility. And I also just want to emphasize too, we're not perfect. I mentioned some documents, a whole slew of documents I know have accessibility issues, but we're working on it and like moving in a positive direction. So we want to contract for digital accessibility as well. We want to require digital accessibility as a standard in your contract documents, all of your contract documents, just so when something sneaks in and it ends up being really important, you can point and say this should be accessible too. You want to build accessibility checks into the deliverable anytime there's custom development or digital documents as the deliverable. So the beginning, the middle, and the end. And those digital documents are really important. And one of the important things to like check too is that they can be converted to a PDF. And that conversion from Word to PDF can be pretty awkward. And there's some specific things that you need to do, especially with some of our contractual documents can be difficult. So that's something to check. And then ensure accessibility experts are integrated into the review of the deliverables. So that final deliverable that we're really doing that thorough check and having, we have our standard accessibility checkers, but then you want to maybe call your friend at State Services for the Blind and see if they will do some testing themselves. So what about the stuff we have? So we have a lot of things that probably have issues. As I mentioned, we're not perfect. I don't think anybody is perfect, but we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good, and we have to keep on proceeding and focusing. So you want to focus on areas of high impact and high touch. Your website is probably the lowest hanging fruit that you have in your organization, and if you know around your state or your local government organization that there's a whole lot of websites that have digital accessibility issues. Now's the time to get a vendor on contract that can help you work on those websites and fix those issues. Our website, for a long time, we had a website that looked like it was built in 2002. And thanks to digital accessibility, we got a brand new website that looks a lot nicer and is much easier to use. But that's kind of stuff that really matters because that's where people are poking around for information and learning how to access the great things that government provides. Systems with public interactions are huge. We have to serve all of the population. We don't get to pick and choose who we serve based on, procuring things that whole groups of people can't use because we didn't make it accessible. So the systems with public interactions are really, really important. Then you have to plan. You have to decide to remediate or replace. And we just replaced our website because it was that bad. But sometimes remediation is possible, and you want to figure the cost and the time and the impact. And sometimes it is faster actually to just stand up something that already exists and already is a digitally accessible product. And the time and the money and the resources matter. And, it's like sitting in the CPO chair, you find out how much time like some of these decisions take, and that every time, that something is not available that's needed can be really problematic. Delivery, like what are the easy wins? What are the things that are going to make people's days better? What is going to reduce complaints within your office? And like sometimes I think Jay's discovered when he points out a document to me that has issues, I'm the one that remediates it myself because I get like very frustrated when I find those things, especially when they should be. It's one that I didn't expect would have issues. But it's like those high touch documents are they're just way more usable for everybody, so it can make a really big impact. And that's where I focused on our contract releases. I know these documents are used a lot and they're used heavily. They're not user friendly in the first place. So I have this huge opportunity to make things work better, procure, or, get something that is digitally accessible, and then, a product that people enjoy engaging with. Then you have to maintain. You have to stay accessible. So that's where the training internal people in your like organization really matters in creating the culture of accessibility like in your workplace. And I have identified in our office like somebody that I'm hopefully providing training so that she is an expert level accessibility person. And it's been actually it's helped her learn that she's kind of interested in actually things like web design and wants to, and that's another way that will support our office is having another person that can help with the website. But it's helped her find an area that she's also interested in. But creating that culture, I, um, I, you know, I think people kind of, I will actually sit down with somebody and I'll say, hey, these are the things that you need to like watch for in these documents when before we put them online, before we publish them. These are the things that you need to check. I talk about those manual checks, the things that Microsoft will never catch. But it has to be the expectation in every workplace. So our top tips for ADA readiness, build digital accessibility into your solicitation documents now. So, that's something that you want to put in there and in like doing it tomorrow will make a huge difference. And then building digital accessibility into your contract documents now. That's something that's pretty easy to do, both of those things. Training internal resources on digital accessibility, especially so they can evaluate vendor capabilities. And once you become like, you know, literate in digital accessibility, you can start to understand like who gets it and who doesn't when you have these conversations. And one of the things I had we were doing an invitation to negotiate with multiple vendors, and one of the negotiators knew a lot about digital accessibility, and one of the things that pushed a vendor over the edge in that process was that they were digital accessibility literate. They were very mature in their understanding of it, and we knew that we'd get something that would be accessible. Engage in accessibility testing for website software and other digital content. And, as we head towards, the deadline, which is about a year away, really focusing on areas of high impact, high touch, and then like really on the things that like remediate or replace inaccessible content, especially if it's things that we want the public to be engaging with, because we serve all of the public, not just specific populations. Procure a list of vendors that are capable of remediation and accessibility testing to support your organization moving towards full digital accessibility. So I mentioned we have a lineup of vendors. They're built within one of our IT procurement programs that can engage in digital accessibility, and they're vendors that have been evaluated, and we know that they're going to deliver good service to the agencies that engage them. And then I just think remembering that everyone has to start somewhere. We saw so much variety in the chat over like how people have engaged with digital accessibility. You're not alone. I find there's more and more partners out that they're willing to provide support. I was at a vendor event and I networked with somebody who offers digital accessibility training, and she told me that they offer webinars weekly because they really want to help people be ready for this ADA accessibility deadline. So there's all kinds of resources out there, and we're going to go to the next slide and talk about some of those resources. Hand it over to you, Jay.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. A couple of things about April. I'm sorry, a couple of things about that. She, we mentioned the Title II deadline. Again, I will remind you that the ADA is in existence now. What Title II does is to specifically name and outline what the expectations are for digital accessibility. In other words, what are the rules we follow? The rules we follow are WCAG 2.1. That's what Title I does. It says, these are the rules. Today, there's nothing written in Title II until that happens. But the ADA still exists. So again, like Rachel said, don't wait. Start working on it now. The Expo folks will be sharing a PDF, an accessible PDF of these slides, and that will have all the links that we have on here. So you can click on the link to our website, as well as other resources like WebAIM, which is a nonprofit that's been involved in accessibility for almost 30 years. And then the World Wide Web Consortium are the ones who own WCAG 2.1. And there's a lot of information there about how you can find more about accessibility. And as Rachel said, on our website, we have training on accessible Word documents, accessible PDF, among other things. Here's the basic background for the laws and guidelines. The ADA itself, Section 508, which is federal procurement law on accessibility. They've been around for a while too, and they include WCAG 2.0. Then the 2.1 and the quick reference guide that I showed the screenshot of earlier. About the WCAG 2, about Title II, we have a fact sheet, the great resource, and quickly read up on Title II and what it involves. Then Rachel made a webinar. The Great Lakes ADA is a great program that offers 3 webinars among others. And I think you want to add to that if you like. Then we have questions. We had a couple other questions as well come in. So Julia, you want to help us figure out what we need to answer in the last few minutes?
Absolutely. So great information. Rachel, quick question. We have a question about, have you approached price lists?
Price lists are something that we found very problematic when I mentioned those contract releases. Like part of the problem with our contract releases is they often contain like just tables and tables of pricing information. And I'll be honest, I don't find it user friendly at all because it's like you practically have to take a ruler to see like what lines up, and it's really frustrating. We are currently working on contract release modernization and trying to integrate a better way of like doing those pricing lists. But it's really like it's when I talk about like why we need everything to be accessible, why we have to build that into like our contract documents to some degree, there's a little bit of pointing back to vendors and saying like, can you provide us something that is more accessible and usable, and pointing to the contract and saying that it's required. But like we have some that go back, years and years, and it's a challenge. But I'll be interested to maybe report back on how our contract release modernization project goes forward, because it's I think going to be really interesting. We're currently operating off of, I don't know how other offices operate, but they're PDFs, and they're just really, really frustrating to use. And now they look like, if we move in this direction, they're going to look more like websites that people like engage with. So we'll see. So like I said, we're not perfect. And I find those like pricing lists really, and when I chat with my counterpart, Luke, and I'm like, why can't you just fix this? Like, why can't these be more accessible? And that's the answer right there, is those lists. So, so that was a great question.
Yeah, well, Jay, also like think about it this way. Just because we did a price this way 10 years ago doesn't mean we have to design the layout today. So sometimes accessibility means stepping back and saying, what's the best way to convey this information? Maybe it's not the way we used to do it. It could be maybe it used to be an Excel spreadsheet with lots of blank tables. Instead, maybe it couldn't be, like she said, a Word document that's in an accessible table format without blank spaces, or it could be with heading. You can heading and bullet. There's all different ways to think about layout and format. If you step back and think about it first, you can make things more accessible.
Thanks, Jay. So that concludes today's presentation. I want to thank our presenters, Jay and Rachel, for the valuable information they've shared and for working with all of us at NASPO to bring it to you. Thank you for attending today's webinar. This webinar qualifies as one contact hour for your continuing education credits. To receive your certificate, please fill out the survey in your browser window once you exited the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the NASPO YouTube page in the coming days. Questions entered into the chat and Q&A boxes have been saved and will follow up via email for any that weren't addressed during the presentation. And also, please remember to check out NASPO's upcoming webinars and the Pulse podcast at naspo.org. Thanks again to our wonderful presenters, and thank you all for attending. Have a great day.